Hello and welcome to CB Talk, the Combined Transport Blackwell Monthly Podcast. Today is July 25th, 2025, and I'm your host, Nick Card, Vice President of Operations. We've got a great program for you today. We're interviewing our first outside guest on the program. We've got Jana Jarvis from the Oregon Trucking Associations in the studio, and that is just fantastic. We're having a really interesting conversation about the legislature, about what's going on in Oregon, in Salem, in DC, and what that means for trucking. But first, the news. Our drivers and employees of the month this month: DJ Larson in Glass and Flatbed, Brad Van Landingham in Blackwell, Joe Gauthier in Heavy Haul, and Angie Peterson in The Office. Thank you all for the incredible job you do, the hard work you put in. Thank you for your dedication and service. Our safety topic of this month is proper hydration. Make sure you drink water, avoid dehydrating drinks, and know the warning signs. Watch out for each other. It's hot. It's easy to get dehydrated. It's easy to lose sight of, the temperature as it climbs, especially if you're securing a load and out there under the sun. Make sure you avoid those risks, avoid those problems. In the news this month, cargo thefts continue to climb. We've seen a 10% increase up from the first quarter of 2025. In particular, metal thefts nearly doubled, and food and beverage thefts increased almost 70%. That means food and beverage thefts now make up over 20% of all thefts. When you're out there, make sure you're keeping an eye on your cargo. Make sure you're locking your reefer trailer. Make sure you're inspecting that. Be mindful of where you park. Thefts are on the rise, and it may happen to you. We're seeing these criminals are using really sophisticated methods to track where trucks are, to figure out where you're going to be, and the response has been a challenge. Congress is now involved, and they've had some recent hearings to address these thefts. Hopefully, we can try to target these particular sophisticated theft rings and bring some of these people to justice. We have an exciting guest in the studio today, our first outsider on the podcast. Joining me today is Jana Jarvis with the Oregon Trucking Association. Jana, it is great to have you on the program.
Thank you so much, Nick. Thanks for inviting me to come and be here.
Absolutely. So just some background. I've known Jana for years through the work I've done with the Oregon Trucking Association, though I would imagine a number of our listeners have no idea what even the Oregon Trucking Association is. So can you tell us a little bit about what you do for OTA and what it is that OTA is trying to do for truckers?
Certainly. The Oregon Trucking Association is the trade association for the trucking industry, and we provide a lot of benefits and services to the membership. Included in that is training, networking events, conferences, educational materials, workers' comp opportunities, things like that. But the most important thing we offer as a trade association is advocacy on behalf of the industry. And so I operate as the president and CEO of OTA, and I am the chief lobbyist for the association.
Okay, so for lobbying, that means you get to go to Salem and
I get to go to Salem. I do. Yes, I do. Wine and dine, right.
Yeah. It's lots of fun, right, being a lobbyist?
It has its challenges and its moments. Yes.
So Salem, I think that's a really good topic to talk about because I know a lot of different stuff has been going on. The Oregon State Legislature, it just wrapped up a session and some things almost happened, but then they didn't. Then there's another session. So, what's going on in Salem, and why does that matter to us?
Every odd number year, we have our long session, which is 165 days, and the even number years is our short session, which is 35 days. So this is the year that we conceivably come in and do big things. Obviously, establish the budget for the state for the biennium, and then have big policy discussions. And the primary topic for this year's session was supposed to be a transportation package, because for the last 3 or 4 years, ODOT has been going around the state and talking to everyone they could and telling them that they are running out of funding for basic maintenance and operation services. And it's hard to sometimes understand that given that we passed a big package in 2017. But when we passed those transportation packages, we dedicated those portions of funds to specific projects. And they don't necessarily go into maintenance and operation. And so when costs rise, like we've all experienced, particularly here in the last 3 to 4 years, and you have all those kinds of experiences, all of a sudden you realize you don't have enough money to keep the people employed that you need to have employed in the agency. And that predicated the need to have a transportation discussion this year.
Well, so help me understand, right? Because most of the transportation funding, that comes out of gas tax, right? That's the way the system is mostly funded?
Well, it has historically been sort of a 2/3, 1/3 funding ratio, with passenger vehicles comprising about 2/3 of that, and that's through gas tax revenue, title and registration fees, things like that go on the light vehicle side of the equation. And then for medium duty and heavy duty trucks, primarily we're funded through weight mile taxes. And so we have, the trucking industry has historically picked up in excess of 1/3 of the cost of Oregon's roads for decades now.
How does that compare to other states?
Well, we are the most expensive state in the nation, far and away. ATRI,
That's
the American Transportation Research Institute, publishes an annual report that compares trucking taxes and fees state by state. And we have had the distinction during my tenure as CEO of being number one for the last several years. And on average, 80,000-pound 5-axle truck pays in excess of $37,000 in trucking taxes and fees, while the national average is a little over $19,000.
Wow, that's a big difference.
It is a big difference. But the biggest issue there, in my mind, is that we're number one. Number two is Connecticut. Number three is California, and they are at the $30,000 range. So the spread between first and second place is also pretty astounding.
So it's not like there's a cluster at the top that's
No,
expensive
no.
like Oregon. No, we stand alone. Number one most expensive state, go Oregon. Wow.
We do.
So we coming in though, we were looking at a transportation package though, and so it was the primary issue. I mean, because I know there's been this issue about trucking overpayment, because that allocation you said about the balance between cars and trucks, that's been way off for at least 6 years. And then also we didn't have enough money to fund these projects that had been already prescribed. So that seems easy enough. We raise taxes on the car side of the equation and we have money and we're done, right?
Well, one would think that's a possibility, except it didn't raise enough money to solve all the problems. And so we got a little excited during this legislative session, and they proposed what amounted to in excess of a $15 billion package for the next 10 years. And to compare that, House Bill 2017, which we passed in 2017, had been the largest transportation package in history, and it was $5.2 billion.
Wow.
So this was 3 times the size of that package.
Government's got to grow.
Apparently.
So
At least something is, right, Nick?
Yeah, right. Not the economy so much. But, so what happened in the legislative session? When did that wrap up, and sort of what's our next steps after that?
Well, constitutionally, the session had to wrap up on June 29th. On Friday, June 27th, it became apparent by about midday that House Bill 2025, which was this year's transportation package, was not going to move forward. And so the governor came over to the building and started working another piece of legislation in hopes of being able to raise a 3-cent gas tax increase in order to be able to fund ODOT, its maintenance operations. And rather than lay off those 1,000 people, we're trying to raise some money. And so we spent the afternoon on that topic. It actually did pass out of committee, but it only passed out of committee because the Senate president had to come and remove one of his members from the dais and take the vote in his place to get the bill to move out of committee. But the Republicans would not allow them to advance it to the floor for a vote that day. And later that evening, everyone said, this is enough. And we sine died about 11:15 that night, and the package died.
All right. So no transportation package, and so now the world we're looking at is ODOT doesn't have enough money. We're not going to be able to get our projects. The roads aren't going to get plowed. I mean, at least that's what I'm hearing ODOT is threatening. I'm sure ODOT's probably could figure out how to go through its couch cushions and be a little bit more efficient.
Well, the Republicans are asking for that, and that was part of the dialogue that happened during the session. Instead of just saying, we need more money, are there things we're spending money on that we could reallocate? And I think this gets back to the point I started with. When we pass transportation packages, we dedicate funds to certain projects or programs. And so ODOT doesn't have the authority to redirect those funds. So unless the legislature comes in and redirects those funds, they have to spend them the way they were earmarked to be spent. And a lot of federal funds come earmarked for specific programs or projects as well. And so their latitude for just basic maintenance and operation funding is fairly limited if they don't have some kind of cost increase that keeps pace with inflation. And so I think they had a legitimate concern, but it imploded on itself because everyone came to the table thinking they had a different sense of perspective than ODOT had.
So what is the next steps then? Are we just not going to have plowed roads in Oregon, or?
Well, it depends on the time of day and the day of the week is my answer on this, because it changes in about every few moments. I get another text, a call, I have meeting with a key legislator, and then I think, well, maybe we are going to fix this. But yesterday, the governor announced that we would have a special session on August 29th. And the purpose of that is to address this issue of ODOT's lack of funding. One of the things that came up in those final hours on June 27th was the 3-cent gas tax was just going to be directed specifically to ODOT, to the state transportation program. Historically, in Oregon, which is a little unique, not all states do this, we take every dollar and we split it. The state gets 50 cents, the counties get 30 cents, and the cities get 20 cents. That 50-30-20 split was not part of that 3-cent conversation. And so when they had the hearing on that bill, it was the cities and counties that turned out to oppose it because they weren't going to get their piece of the pie. And so what's being proposed now is a 6-cent gas tax increase to address city and county needs as well. And of course, there are provisions on a daily basis that are getting added into the bill. I think the governor's desire was to keep this as limited and as clean a fix as possible. But there are a number of organizations, ourselves included, that are advocating for the pieces that we need in a transportation bill. Because from our perspective, if they do pass a bill, if they're able to accomplish this objective, my concern is if we don't get what we need in it, it'll be a number of years before anyone wants to come back and have this conversation again.
Sure. So what are some of the things that the trucking industry is trying to accomplish here with this?
Well, we're the only state in the nation that still relies exclusively on a weight mile tax. It's an old, antiquated form of taxation that more than half the states used to have, but they've all dispensed of that in the last couple of decades and moved to a diesel tax. And part of the problem with the weight mile tax, not only is it cumbersome and difficult to administer, we have 87 different tax rates in our state, 87. So if you're a specialty carrier and you reconfigure your truck multiple times, you might have to calculate that multiple times in order to be able to pay the appropriate amount of taxes. And it's very convoluted, expensive to administer, expensive to comply with, and easy to evade. In fact, we recognize evasion's a big part of the problem, and we did a study on evasion, and the agency decided that the evasion rate was about 10%. So you know what we did? We raised your taxes 10% to cover that cost of evasion. So
that's great.
Yeah, exactly. So no wonder we're so much more expensive than everybody else,
so
right?
So just 10% because we can't actually collect all the taxes.
Correct.
That are owed.
Yes. And we don't participate in IFTA and IRP to the full extent. If we did that, we would have a mechanism to be able to look for evasion. It's pretty hard to evade a diesel tax. It's possible, but it's much more tricky and more complicated.
You pay it at the pump.
You pay it at the pump. Yeah, exactly. And so I think if we can move to a system that's cleaner, harder to evade, I think we will have probably excess revenue than we anticipate.
So is the trucking industry trying to propose a wholesale shift to a diesel tax?
We have been. For a number of years, we've been talking about that. The only problem in that is that it doesn't raise enough money to meet our obligation for fair share. And so what has come out of that, instead of just a simplified diesel tax, is let's take a look at our weight mile tax rates, those 87 rates. We've created we did a study and an analysis, took us a couple of years. We have a 10 rate structure now, a simplified weight mile, that would be much easier to administer, much easier to comply with. So that would be part of your funding obligation, that along with the diesel tax. And then we could participate in IFTA and IRP, and it'd be much easier to assess that we are actually getting the monies we need from folks that are traveling through our state. It isn't the Oregon-based carriers, by and large, that are evading the taxes, but it's the onesie and twosie that's driving through the state and manages to get through without stopping at the scale and hasn't filed any paperwork. And
some mom and pop operation in California that runs local, and they get a load up to Washington or Eugene or whatever, and they take it and they say nothing.
Exactly. And I'm sure, and I contend, that there's a lot of business from Vancouver, Washington that moves over into the city of Portland that never crosses a scale and then turns around and goes right back. So that's my personal contention.
Yeah.
That is not OTA's position, but I will tell you, I've watched it. So I think that there's an opportunity for us to address that evasion and hopefully lower your cost.
Yeah.
I'd like to not be number one.
Yeah, that would be nice. I mean, I think that'd be good for all Oregonians.
Exactly.
Cheaper groceries. I mean, man, it's not like costs are getting any cheaper anytime
No,
soon either.
They are not.
Wow. So what else is OTA looking at with this proposal?
Well, in addition to moving to a modernized weight mile tax with a diesel tax, we're also looking at how we assess our fair share. For historically, and this goes back to the 1930s, when the federal road system started coming into place and trying to assign who's responsible to pay for what. Most of the discussion centered on wear and tear on the road. This vehicle weighs more and has more impact on the road. It's going to chew up the asphalt faster, so they should pay more. It was kind of the general premise. But there are other ways to assign cost responsibility, and I maintain that we can't be the most expensive state in the nation for heavy vehicles and one of the least expensive states in the nation for passenger vehicles. There's some inequity in that particular calculation as well. And so we've introduced the topic. Policymakers are intrigued at that conversation. Our state economist has the ability to determine what the study should look like. And so those conversations are ongoing as well. How do we define what is our responsibility? Is it, in fact, 35%, or should it be closer to 25% in terms of the cost of the roads?
Well, I'll tell you, that's an interesting thought to me, because I think about light vehicles. I mean, gas in Oregon isn't like it's that much cheaper than California. So I'm surprised to hear that Oregon's light vehicles, I would think we would also be some of the most expensive light vehicles in the state. In the country.
Our gas taxes are in the top tier of gas tax rates, but our registration and title fees are among the lowest in the nation. So when you look at total cost of ownership in your taxes and fees, we're towards the bottom.
Gotcha. Okay, that makes sense.
Yeah, when I moved here from Washington, I couldn't believe how cheap it was to register your car in Oregon. Because I used to annually pay several $100s a year to register my car.
And here you get 2 years for like $125 or something.
Well, I think when I first moved here, that'll show you how old I am. It was significantly less than that.
Oh, yeah.
So, yeah. So I think we're trying in some ways to catch up with other states in terms of the passenger vehicle side of the equation.
So we're looking at trying to get a new rate structure and for how we sort of collect that money for the heavy vehicle share, trying to look at some other ways to calculate that heavy vehicle share. Any other interesting goals of the trucking industry when it comes to this?
Well, one of the things I hope to be able to do, and I'm not sure how to do it legally, we've had a lot of conversation around this, is if we run into this problem again in the future and the legislature chooses not to address it, how do we get our overpayment problem fixed? And so we are testing some language to see if it meets constitutional requirements that would allow the Department of Administrative Services, for example, to lower rates. If it's either cars or trucks that are overpaying, they could come in and say, this isn't equitable, we're going to lower these rates. Okay. I think the governor and legislative leadership are concerned that lowering would mean less revenue to ODOT. So they want some kind of ability to also raise rates if one of the parties is underpaying, and that starts crossing that constitutional line of that's the legislature's authority to impose taxes. And so we're toying with the language around that still, but trying to put some kind of a mechanism in place that would force action, because we have spent a ton of money trying to litigate this issue. And it's wonky. People don't understand it. Even the judge didn't understand it very well when we took it to court. So it's a tough concept, and we need a better process to be able to make adjustments when the legislature fails to act.
So I know we talked briefly about the trucking overpayment. Can you explain more what that means, kind of what those numbers are, and how did we get into that situation in the first place?
Well, historically, we do every 2 years what we call the Highway Cost Allocation Study. And I sit on that committee. There's a small group of us. And it's very wonky. It's probably the best way to describe it. It is an analysis that is based on what projects is ODOT going to build, how is ODOT going to spend their money, and in this fashion, if they spend money on this project, who's responsible for paying for that project? Is it 50% cars, 50% trucks, or is it 75% cars and 25% trucks? I mean, it looks at all the lists of projects that ODOT is anticipating building and how they're intending to spend their money, and then it allocates responsibility for payment of that between cars and trucks. And we spend about $250,000 on that study every 2 years, and we dust it off and put it on the shelf, and then nothing happens with it. But it is supposed to guide the legislature to make adjustments when one or the other parties are underpaying or overpaying. And starting about 6 years ago, the spreads started increasing. We saw in the 1921 study that trucks were overpaying about 3%, which is still
2021. You said 1921.
Yeah, 2019 to 2021.
2019. Okay,
19 to
2020.
2020.
Okay.
Sorry, I was abbreviating in my
There
brain. We saw that there was an imbalance starting. Historically, we've been within 1 or 2% for decades. And all of a sudden that imbalance started, and then it started growing. Then we were overpaying by 16%, and then we were overpaying by 35%. And the most recent study shows that we're overpaying about 25%. And that equates to hundreds of millions of dollars. I think the trucking industry has paid in excess of $500 million more than they should have in the last 6 years. That's real money.
Yeah.
And so trying to get the legislature to care about that and find a way to fix that. But, you know, it's much harder to raise gas taxes because those folks are all constituents, right? Mm. It's much easier to let industry carry the burden, and that has been the problem we've been faced with. And that's why we need a mechanism that would force them into action if they don't take action.
So not only is trucking the most expensive in Oregon, but we had a legislature that willingly let it be even more expensive than it should have been.
Yes, we did. We do. I don't think they knew how to fix it exactly, because of those raising your gas taxes is, you know, makes you vulnerable to your constituency in the next election. Mm-hmm. We are, they're less vulnerable dealing with us. And so that's
Yeah.
harder to fix.
So, what do you give the trucking industry's shot at success with this new legislation coming up?
Well, first off, we actually have to have legislation, and we actually have to meet. And while there's a date that's been defined, there's a long way to go before August 29th to see whether or not we're going to have a plan to pull together. I am encouraged. I've had some great conversations with the governor's office. Governor Kotek is very pragmatic in many ways. She's a problem solver, and I have worked on a lot of issues with her over the last couple of decades. And it was easy for her to understand the issues that I was laying out, and we've had some great meetings since then. And so they seem to be, at this point in time, inclined to include some of the provisions that we think are important to us in whatever their fix is going to be. But I haven't seen anything in print. Until I see it in print, I don't know for sure.
Talk is cheap, as they say.
Talk is cheap, yes, exactly.
So, if we can switch gears for a second, I know your primary focus is on the state legislature and dealing. You are Oregon's Trucking Association, after all, but obviously it's not just the state of Oregon that has an impact on trucking. The federal government does as well. We've had Trump in office now for 7 months. What have we seen from, Republicans control the Congress? Have we seen big change for the trucking in DC? Is there stuff coming down the pike on that? What are you seeing in DC that's impacting what we're doing here in Oregon?
Well, there's a lot of change that's coming in. It's coming at us pretty fast. I think some of the best things that I have seen are coming out of the EPA. And one of the issues I have yet to discuss with you, Nick, is the fact that we were, at the start of this year, unable to purchase a new diesel truck in our state because we had adopted California's Advanced Clean Truck Rule that effective January 1, 2025. And so that really, even though the economy has been tough and a lot of trucking companies were kind of holding off purchasing new equipment anyway, the simple fact of the matter was even if you wanted to, you couldn't buy one. And so we worked very hard here in Oregon to try to delay that rule, the adoption of that rule, and we were successful in doing that. We were able to move that to 2027, but not long after that, then the EPA, under Secretary Zeldin, has come back in and has pulled those waivers that they had granted to California several years ago, and basically told California, you can't have different air quality emission standards for vehicles than the federal government. And so what had happened previously was we were not able to compete with states like Idaho or Arizona or Utah that were not playing by those sets of rules. We adopted California's standards, hook, line, and sinker. You couldn't change any of the standards that they had. You had to adopt them in their entirety. But their program simply didn't work for us. And I think we have about a dozen battery electric Class 8 trucks in the state, about a dozen. This program would have required that 7% of the sales this year would have been battery electric trucks. That's certainly more than 12.
Yeah.
And so I think the best thing that happened was the EPA pulling those waivers, and it's really, really been helpful to the trucking industry, certainly helpful to the manufacturers, but even more helpful to the dealer community. They were the ones that were limited. They all of a sudden had a whole sales force that couldn't do anything.
Yeah. So. Well, with all that, I've been hearing the OEMs they had made an agreement with California and that they're going to continue to comply with those rules. I mean, does that...
Well, they made the agreement prior to these waivers being pulled. Mm-hmm. I do know that. The question whether or not is that will that agreement stand up in court? And I think that's what's likely to get tested next. Mm-hmm. And it depends on which manufacturer you talk to as to how they feel about it. So it's to be determined, I believe.
Okay.
But we have Daimler as the manufacturer based here in Oregon, and I have worked very closely with them over the last 2 or 3 years on this issue. And truck manufacturers are having enough trouble trying to keep their doors open right now with the economy as it is, and with trucking in a freight recession. It's been hard enough to sell new trucks when you start imposing those kind of environmental regulations over the top of it, it was just a death knell to the manufacturers.
Well, I saw nationwide new truck sales are down something like 10% or more year over year.
I haven't seen the numbers, but I did see the news announcement. I believe it was in the Oregonian last week that said that Daimler would be laying off over 2,000 people. So,
Wow.
We're worried about the 500 people at ODOT, but Daimler's laying off 2,000. Intel's announced they're laying off 2,400 in Oregon. Nike's laying off over 500. I mean, we're going through some tough times economically in our state.
Wow. Anything else of note coming
Aren't
out
I
of
cheery?
DC?
And we need something cheery to
we need
talk
something
about.
cheery
Nick.
Well, yeah, let's talk about cheery things. Other good news coming out of DC?
Other good news. Well, I think that, we have our very own Lori Chavez de Remmer as the new labor secretary, and a lot of those labor standards that we were concerned about, like the independent contractor rule that impacted trucking significantly, those kinds of approaches have been reversed. So that's encouraging for the industry as well. I know that Secretary Duffy for the Transportation Department has some very proactive approaches to trying to help trucking get up and going again. So I think there will be some good things coming down the road, but we do need a little bit more time for some of these policies to play out.
Gotcha. That's good. Yeah, I saw something about the FMCSA. I hadn't seen anything concrete about it, but FMCSA was trying to come up with like a deregulation plan to specifically cut and trim regulation. And I've heard the joke that trucking is the most deregulated industry in the nation, and I feel like that's true, man. With all the rules that have come out the last 10 years or so, it's a very regulated industry.
That's what I tell everyone. That is my line, Nick. We are the most deregulated industry there is. So, I think that Secretary Duffy is really focused on that, and I think their intention is to remove 10 regulations for every new regulation they impose.
That's great.
Let's
get some more regulations in there then, so we can clean this mess up.
Right, and a lot of those regulations are things that are important topics, but we have confused the regulation in the way we've defined it to the point that people don't know how to implement it. And so I think they're also just not wholesale throwing the baby out with the bathwater, but going back in and saying what makes sense and what doesn't make sense for 2025.
Well, I can tell you something that we do talk about a lot here at Combined is the difference between being safe and being compliant. And I've noticed that the gap between safety and compliance seems to get larger and larger and larger every year. There are a number of critical safety things that we do that there's really no regulation on, and then there's a ton of regulation on stuff that is, at its core, it's safety focused, but it's like the regulation's taken on a life of its own and now has lost that connection. And so, sure, you may have been safe, but you didn't comply, or sure, you complied, but that doesn't mean you were safe. And that's really not, to me, a good place for our regulatory environment to be in.
Well, the best news of all, Nick, is that we have a seat at the table now to have conversations with the federal government over those kinds of issues. And I think that's what's most encouraging at the moment. I know that ATA's CEO, Chris Beer, has been up on Capitol Hill testifying on a pretty regular basis. And I was at a meeting with him last week, and he stated that he had 4 hearings coming up in the next 2 weeks. So they're very interested, Congress is very interested in hearing from our industry about what they can do to help us rather than hurt us.
That's good. That's a good happy note to end on.
It is a good note.
Well, before we wrap up our conversation, I always like to chat a little bit with my guests to get to know them just a little bit better. And Jana, I know you have some very interesting history before you got into the trucking industry. Would you share with us a little bit about sort of your journey to being with OTA?
I'd be happy to, Nick. I think one of the things I didn't tell you was that I went to college, got a business degree with the goal of being in the fashion industry.
Really?
Yes.
Jana Jarvis, fashionista.
I did. I wanted to go to school in New York. My father said, I think it's smarter just to get a business degree and do that, and thankfully he was right. But I did spend a couple of years with Nordstrom when I got out of college and quickly discovered that that was not my objective in life. And I ended up taking a job with Johnson Controls in the automotive battery division in Canby, Oregon. And I spent a number of years in the automotive battery industry promoting batteries and battery electric cars, interestingly enough, in the mid to late 80s. We were all about the transition from gasoline engines to battery electric engines. And so I kind of am amused at this because I started my career pushing it, and now I'm ending my career fighting it. But I did spend, during the course of that time, I did speak to the National EPA Convention on battery recycling, and I remember asking people how they got to the convention and reminded them that none of them would have been able to have gotten there if they hadn't had a battery to power whatever it was that they, whether it was an airplane or a train or a car that brought them there, they wouldn't have been able to get to the convention. And so I started there, got very involved in advocacy work on behalf of Johnson Controls because we had lead and acid and all kinds of lovely ingredients that went into our product, and there were a number of regulations coming at us. And so I started doing lobby work for them and got spread pretty thin and decided I needed to either focus on my marketing job or my lobbying job, and I took a job with the Realtors, the Oregon Association of Realtors, and I spent a decade there building their government affairs department. And I transitioned from that into the trucking industry because when I was in real estate, we cared a lot about roads, and I worked a lot with OTA about investment in new roads and new infrastructure. And so long story, but
that is fascinating. I would never have guessed in a million years that fashion was where
Yes.
you started out your journey.
It was.
But I know. I was, as you're talking about batteries, one of the things that I've talked to a lot of legislators about in my advocacy is I would love to get rid of diesel. I'd love to be able to charge from a grid and have cheap power and reduce that expense. I mean, it's our single largest expense is diesel fuel. It's not a check I want to cut. But there's a big difference between something that sounds really good because wouldn't it be nice if, and something that's actually doable. And so appreciate your advocacy work because that's kind of the rubber meets the road where you have to sort of bash fantasy over the head and bring it back to earth.
we have a member up in the Portland area that went all in on battery electric trucks, both the medium duty and the heavy duty arena, and they have done quite a bit of analysis of what that electricity is costing them and how they have to manage charging those trucks in order to end up paying comparable to the cost of their diesel inputs. Mm-hmm. So while it might sound like we'd get away with it being cheaper if we went to battery electric, it may not, in fact, be that much cheaper at the end of the road.
Well, that's a little sour note to end on.
Sorry.
This, but that's okay. All right, we'll go back to reducing regulation. That makes me happy. So, well, Jana, thank you so much for your time today. It's been awesome to have you on the program. Thanks for telling us and all about the sort of the legislative and lobbying world behind what it is we do every day.
Well, thank you, Nick, for inviting me. And to all your employees that hear this, I want to thank all of them for running such a great company and being such a great part of OTA.
Thank you, Jana.
Thank you.
Thank you again, Jana, for the wonderful interview. Our next episode will be out on August 22nd. Please let us know what you think about having Jana on. If we get some positive feedback, we will continue to have some more outside guests. So please share your thoughts. If you got any questions, send them to us via Facebook or email them to us at cbtalk@combinedtransport.com. We appreciate your participation. It's your engagement that makes this podcast work. Thank you for your time. Thank you for listening, and thank you for being a part of the Combined Transport team.